It didn't take President Trump long to back down from his threat of sacking the Federal Reserve chair, Jerome Powell, having called him a major loser and always too late and wrong. And perhaps it's because the markets reacted as they did, with the dollar slumping further and another sell-off in equities. President Trump now says he has no intention of firing him. Now, it got us thinking about the role and power of central banks, which means it's time to call on my fellow presenter, Evan Davies, again for a deep dive into central banks. And Evan is back with me.
Hello, Sarah. Nice to be here.
OK, I need a primer. The role of central banks. How would you sum up what they do?
I would say they have their foot on the accelerator and the brakes of the speed of the economy, the motors of the economy, using monetary policy. And what do we mean by monetary policy? We mean interest rates. We mean their ability to control the amount of bank lending that is going on that creates money supply under certain definitions. Their control of printed notes and coins. They control the money supply. They control some of the very short-term interest rates that prevail in the banking system, because they can borrow and lend at certain rates in the short term. And using those instruments, they can either slow the economy down by tightening money supply, making it more expensive to borrow, making it more advantageous to save, by making the pound go up or down somewhat in the foreign exchanges. They can use this tool of monetary policy to control the speed of the economy, the amount of spending in the economy, the amount of heat in the economy. And that is their central power. And then alongside that, they have an enormously big role in the banking system. Because if anything is going wrong in the banking system, like a bank says we've run out of money, they're the ones who can step in and say, I'll tell you what, we'll lend you some money. We might even create some money to lend to you to make sure that you don't topple over. So they're a kind of very important force in the banking system, and they're a very important force in regulating the speed of the economy.
Okay. And those central banks that are independent, who have, and I presume it's the biggest lever, the control of interest rates, that they really, because that used to be a political role, didn't it?
Well, absolutely. And in this country, you can remember chancellors would announce an interest rate cut. It feels like such ancient history now. And then we went from that to the Ken and Eddie show, which was Kenneth Clarke as Chancellor, Eddie George as bank governor, where they would sit and decide on interest rates together and then publish the minutes of their meetings. So you could see, is Kenneth Clarke listening to what the Bank of England says, or is he just making it up as he goes along? And then in 97, we went to fully independent. But you know what? The post-war, the story of central banking post-Second World War is really one of countries deciding we don't want politicians making these decisions about interest rates. We want to give it to central banks.
OK, and have they done a demonstrably better job? Because there are still banks that are not independent. And was there, pre-97, was it much worse? Was the economy worse off?
It's really interesting, this. So there are lots of papers that have been published looking at central bank independence and how it works and whether it's worked. And we should say, by the way, there's a bit of a spectrum. You can have more or less independent central banks. You can sort of grade them. Most of the academic economists will tell you, yes, central banks have worked at solving a problem, solving a very specific problem when it comes to monetary policy. I'll tell you what the problem they solve is, because I think this is the thing to understand. You need to use some discretion when you're applying your foot on the brakes and the accelerator for the speed of the economy. Sometimes it's a good thing to speed it up a little bit and get some growth. If everybody's saving and no one's spending any money, you might say, we need to give this some gas so that people will spend a bit more. So you want somebody who can regulate the speed of the economy. That's the kind of background to it. But there's often a little bit of an incentive to say, let's get a little bit more growth. Inflation may come down the line when it's all overheated and gone wrong, but that is going to be in a few years' time, and we'll have the growth up front. And it's that if you like, it's those delays in the inflationary impact of some of these decisions that mean there's often a short-term temptation
So
to
the
go
political
for growth.
gain, if you've got an election coming up, you'd want to cut interest rates. But there is surely an argument as well, is because the other levers for the economy are what you do with taxes.
Yeah.
And if you're sitting in government thinking, this is what I want to do with taxes, because actually there's an advantage to doing this, but it only works if at the same time I cut interest rates. That's surely the argument for having all the control in one place.
Yeah, you have hit on it. And that's the serious argument about independent central banks, is coordinating fiscal policy, which is another. It's like having someone sitting in the passenger seat next to the driver with their own accelerator and brake. And if you're operating against each other, it can get very messy. And here's what might happen. You see, you might have a chancellor or a treasury secretary in the US who wants to speed up the economy while the bank's trying to slow it down. So the treasury secretary is going to ramp up borrowing to get more spending in the economy. And you can end up with perhaps more borrowing than you would want. And so people do say, yeah, we should coordinate this. Incidentally, Sarah, little known, little remembered fact, when Gordon Brown made the Bank of England independent in this country back in the 90s, 97, there was a big debate about it. Remember, the Conservative Party were against it at the time. The person who was the journalist who took a stand and warned about all sorts of dangers of it was the then economics editor of the Financial Times, who was Robert Choate. Robert Choate, who went on to run the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is another kind of organ of the state that's a bit like an independent central bank. It's an independent body.
He didn't want it.
Well, he was warning about this problem you've alerted us to. You can end up in a mess where one's putting your foot on the brake and the other on the accelerator.
Which brings us to the US, because I remember years ago we used to talk about Alan Greenspan, the then chair of the Federal Reserve, raising his eyebrow. I mean, his ability to communicate was, markets would read facial expressions because there was so little coming out. Suddenly we have, it's not a slangy match because Jerome Powell's not really coming back with too much. But it's unheard of, the whole major loser, always late, always wrong.
Yeah, Donald Trump is... Well, he's saying, I'm not going to sack Jerome Powell, but he's making his views very clear. Now, actually, Sarah, I want to play you a clip. You don't even know this is coming.
No, I don't.
I want to play you a clip because Donald Trump isn't the first president who basically says, I want lower interest rates and more growth, and I'm less worried about any inflation that might create than you are. And I just want to play this clip because this is President Nixon in 1970 facing an election in 1972, and he's swearing in a new chair of the Fed, a guy called Arthur Burns, who actually is a Republican, so a kind of tame governor. And we've just got this little excerpt of Nixon at the swearing-in ceremony back in 1970. It just shows you nothing's new in history.
Ladies and gentlemen, as all of you know, the Federal Reserve is independent, certainly independent of the President, although the Congress would suggest that it is not independent of the Congress. I respect that independence. On the other hand, I do have the opportunity as President to convey my views to the Chairman of the Federal Reserve in meetings of the Quadriad, along with the Secretary of the Treasury and the Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. I have some very strong views on some of these economic matters, and I can assure you that I will convey them privately and strongly to Dr. Burns in the meetings of the Quadriad. I respect his independence. However, I hope that independently he will conclude that my views are the ones that should be followed.
So there has always been this tension between the politics of lower interest rates, short-term growth, and the longer-term interest of the economy, which is long-term. You don't get a benefit out of injecting inflation. Short term, you might get a bit of growth out of it.
But do you listen to that? I mean, why would it matter, really? I mean, if one assumes that your central bank is strong enough to feel independent, to act independently, surely it's fine if a president says, look, I think interest rates should be lower.
Yeah, well...
I mean, they only say what everybody presumes they think anyway.
What doesn't matter what Jerome Powell thinks or even what the president thinks. I think it does matter what the world outside thinks. So here's the problem, and it's a really important one for central bankers. If everybody believes you are committed to keeping inflation, say, at 2%, and they believe you will keep inflation at 2%, if they really believe that, that's called credibility.
Yeah.
It's much easier to keep inflation at 2% than if they think inflation's going to be 5% and you want it to be 2%. Because if the world outside thinks there's no credibility to this central bank, the president is going to get his way, or the president may sack him and force lower interest rates, and we'll have an accelerated economy creating inflation rather than growth in the medium term. If the markets, if the public, if the unions, if wage bargainers all think inflation is going to be higher, boy, is it hard to keep it low, because they'll all be putting up their prices or putting up their wage demands, or saying when they think about interest rates and borrowing, I need quite a high interest rate to cover the expected inflation that we're going to have in 2 years. So that's why credibility in the system matters. And
Because it's all about expectation.
yeah, it's much easier to keep inflation low if people think inflation is going to be low.
Okay, but you're talking about inflation, which of course is the mandate of the Bank of England. It's got that single focus. The Federal Reserve also has to take account of employment, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, so in general, central banks will say we want price stability, but there's always and price, inflation stability and not letting it get out of control is probably good for all the other objectives you have in the long term. But there is, and this is why you do need some discretion in the system. Let's suppose you have a shock like we had in 2022 when oil prices, gas prices soared, Russia invades Ukraine, suddenly world food prices jump, grain prices, all of that happened. You've got a massive price rise shock that enters all the Western economies. You need some discretion about, are we just going to smash that inflation in 2 months by driving the economy into the dust so that no one puts prices up? Or are we going to kind of gradually bring that inflation down over 2 years so that we don't have to kind of squeeze the economy into the dirt to get there? So you do want some inflation, you do want some time to get inflation down, and you need some discretion about, I've got other things on my mind than just instantly getting inflation down. I do want some growth and some jobs, and long term, keeping inflation low is the best way to get everything, but short term, not always.
Is part of the reason we are in a situation where there's this row and question over the role of the central bank because of what happened post-COVID, where central banks were seen as, well, pumping too much money in, what we haven't talked about, them sort of quantitative easing, effectively adding to the money supply, and not recognising the inflationary threat quickly enough?
Yeah, I think central banks have made mistakes. I think it's probably possible to argue other people would have made those mistakes.
Because if they knew then
banks
what they know now, they would have acted differently, but they couldn't have known.
Exactly. It's easier in hindsight to say all of that. And would politicians have done better? These are valid questions, but I don't think anyone would say managing an economy through a pandemic is straightforward. And it is interesting, a lot of central banks made sort of similar mistakes. So obviously bright people do that.
There is one other role of the central banks, which is, well, I say it's a role. It's basically they just act as vaults. I mean, the astonishing thing about the Bank of England is the amount of gold bars it's sitting on, something like 400,000 gold bars worth over 200 billion.
They're not all the Bank of England's, though, are they? I think some of they do hold gold for lots of other people. So there's a kind of
and
safekeeping
the likes
role
of JP Morgan and HSBC have been trying to get it out, worried about tariffs and sort of ship it across.
And there's been this queues of lorries at the Bank of England to take it out. And I think that has been an issue to try and put it in other vaults. Yeah, I mean.
But
it used to all be about gold.
That much gold, just to be clear. Gold. Sorry, just this, because it's a picture that equivalent to almost 10 football pitches is the size of the vault under the Bank of England.
I've heard that if you know the central line at Bank Station, it's very curvy, screeches in and out, and there's a massive mind the gap And I've always
Should we
heard...
be drilling through the wall?
I've always heard that's because it's avoiding the Bank of England, but I've no idea of whether that's apocryphal or true. But what it does say, though, is that historically, we've always wanted to constrain. A good monetary system can't be at the behest of a king who's willing to debase the coinage to print money to get whatever he wants. And, always we've tried to find ways to control the money supply. So gold was the way of doing that. You tied your currency to gold, the gold standard, and that stopped you printing too much money because it was the central bank was kind of setting interest rates in order to make sure gold and the currency were sort of one and the same, or fixed in value. And that was a kind of a way in which, prior to independent central banks, you had a kind of discipline, an anchor to the system that stopped it just printing money with abandon as well as you could.
So independence is really important.
Well, views differ on that, Sarah. But
I mean, China has a lot more control over their economy.
Yeah, and you can have politicians who'll run a central bank rather like a central banker would. So I mean, let's pretend that politicians are incapable of doing it. It's just they may have incentives not to. I do remember John Gieve, former deputy governor of the Bank of England, did say to me once when I was talking to him about it, this is after the financial crash, the great financial crash. He did say, because he had been there, it was on his watch, it all happened as a deputy governor. He said, I think we central bankers should be very humble because in the UK, we've been running monetary policy for 1 decade and we've just had the worst financial crash in 2 generations on our watch. So when we think about how good we are, we should recognise that, as central bankers, we do sometimes let things get wrong. The old line was that the central banker's job is to take the punch bowl away just as the party's getting going. That's actually probably the most famous central bank metaphor that's ever been used.
So was he sort of accepting some responsibility?
Yeah, well, I think he was accepting that mistakes had been made in the run-up to the crash, that central bankers hadn't appreciated the degree to which instability was building up. They persuaded themselves that markets knew what they were doing and their markets had created lots of fancy new securities that were bringing stability to the system, not instability, So they're not all powerful. They're not, they make mistakes just like everybody else does. The question is, do they make more or fewer mistakes than everybody else?
That was Evan and me figuring it out. If you have an economic question you would like answered, do let us know. You can email us at worldatone@bbc.co.uk.